Anyone here from Sony first? Okay, good. I'm going to pick on Sony. Qualcomm, I know. I'm going to be nice to Qualcomm, kind of, a little bit. So I'm Josh. I have a company. We break things. We break them for money, and that's what we do. We enjoy it. It's a lot of fun. I do hardware. And really, my happy place is the Linux kernel. Gruck gave me a hard time last night because my slides are horrible as far as getting information. Sorry, deal with it. I wrote a white paper. It's on GitHub. I'll link it later. If you want to actually get source and technical details for this talk, there's 150 pages that I wrote. Have fun with that. This is going to be pretty pictures because I like to talk in front of pretty pictures. This whole research kind of started when I started talking to Mudge at DARPA for Cyber Fast Track. And a lot of it was the community in general is looking at AV and looking at corporate networks and all these kind of things that we do, and that's interesting, and we play a game. Once you shift over to state-sponsored malware, unlimited budgets, that game completely changes. It's actually really interesting to me, and not many people are poking there. So I asked Mudge, like, will you fund me to create a couple of theoretical weapons that aren't in the wild, but are stereotypical of state-sponsored tricks and tools, and just kind of present them so we can see a different world. And he was like, well, I can't fund weapons. This is DARPA. So why don't you make a weapon and then make some sort of really lame POC to defeat that weapon? This talk is the POC for that. So he funded me to try to break a whole bunch of phones, and then I'm telling you about it and putting it on GitHub, nullifying any weaponization, and having fun. So, like I said, I open source everything I can. And when I gave this talk, or a variant of this talk at Microsoft, they asked if I owned every image I'm going to use, and I don't. I'm sorry, they're all on GitHub, or on Google. Which is like open source, right? So today we'll talk about just assumptive design, where all the problems that I see in hardware start. From there, we'll kind of go into universal exploitation. Story 2 or 3, depending on how you want to count, is actually where we're going to start playing with fire and batteries and whatnot. There's a couple more memes, and then a talk I added last night at the end of this, again, to mess with Gruck. So, assumptive design. In general, software, hardware, you're a CPA. I don't care what you do for a living. Everyone comes out of school, they go to a company, they're a noob at that company, they find someone to mentor them, they learn how to actually do the job, because you come out of school and you kind of have an idea, but then you relearn everything. This is really true for software development. The problem is you don't really get to pick your mentor, right? Like, you may meet a guy at a company and be like, oh, I like you, you're smart, so I'm going to learn from you. But that guy also just learned from someone when he got out of school. So you have this kind of generational, I think I know what I'm doing because my mentor said that's the right way to do it. I think, like, you see these generational problems. It's why we're still seeing string copy issues, right? It's not because it's easy, it's because it's easy and someone told you that's the way to do it. So this is really true in software, and we're used to seeing it. We're kind of starting to fix it there. But in hardware, this really still happens all the time. So whenever I actually talk to hardware vendors, one of the first things I try to tell people is, just because you learned it, and just because you trust and respect the person that taught you that, including me, I could be completely BSing this whole thing, right? I mean, question all of your assumptions, because that's what I'm going to attack, is all the assumptions that you made. So another caveat, science is hard. I'll like really smooth over some of the more technical things here because it gets in the way of the actual story that we're going to tell. But the white paper covers everything in depth. If you have any questions, please read that. So I wanted to attack all the phones. I didn't just want to attack Sony. I didn't want to attack Samsung. I wanted to start poking at a hardware level and see what looks the same and how we can attack everything together. Because hardware is not magic. Like we said before, assumptive design, hardware guys screw up too. So universal exploitation. In the US and most of the world, except for this nice little pocket here, Qualcomm is who makes socks. SOCs run your phone. It's a system on a chip. That is what controls the world. I forget your market share, but it's like 9 million% globally or something. No, I think in the US it's over 80% market share, or 90, like it's ridiculous. China is about the only country that I know of that Qualcomm at least doesn't have 50% penetration in for Android phones. So if you want to attack Android at the heart, yeah, they control the world. So from my interests, they're my platform of choice, right? I mean, everyone is going to run them. Baseband-wise, it's even worse, but main processor, we're looking at least 50% market penetration. These guys make SOCs. SOCs do everything you can't really see in this picture, but it's their advertising stuff, right? They've got some CPUs in there, which they advertise as your cores. They've got a GPU. A lot of times they just roll in the baseband right there, or they'll have an external baseband. You've got nav, you've got Wi-Fi. It's everything that is a phone wrapped in silicon. To sell these things to hardware vendors, Qualcomm makes a reference platform. It's basically like a sales brochure. It's, hey, I'm Sony and I want to make a new phone. What should I use? And Qualcomm's like, well, here's this thing that uses our new chip. You should buy it. We'll come back to that. My attack platform that I started really looking at here was the Sony Xperia Z. I arbitrarily picked it with the small list of vendors that I had not signed an NDA for. So I've never signed an NDA with Sony. Maybe some of the other companies I have, which is why I didn't attack them directly. You take the Sony apart, this is what it looks like. It's actually fairly pretty. You've got the PCB up there in the corner, which is what we care about. I take a lot of phones apart. So that guy runs the Qualcomm S4 Pro. The Moto X also runs it. The LG Nexus 4 runs the same thing. They've got a different variant of the same chip that runs the S3. I mean, you can start seeing penetration from Qualcomm here. This powers basically every high-end phone on the market. And they're all based on kind of this same design. So each vendor makes a phone, but they all kind of have these same problems. And I started wondering why. Like, I took all the PCBs apart and like set them on my desk and looked at them, and it's like, well, you know, they're physically maybe slightly the same size, but they all look the same. All the traces go the same place, and they're just not doing anything creative. Why is that? Well, everyone just duct tapes and wraps around this thing, which is our sales pamphlet I was talking about. So you can buy these, or you can try to. They've got great specs, this like quad core, blah, 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 blah. It's a phone. You go to Qualcomm's website and you're like, I want to buy this Meta phone that everything's based off of that Josh is talking about. You can put it in your shopping cart and pay $800 US and click accept, and they'll charge your credit card. And then about 2 or 3 weeks later, when you're going, where's my phone? You'll get an email basically saying, you're a security researcher, you're a hacker, we're not going to give you this thing, sorry. That's cool because I bought one anyway, because eBay wins. We have a bunch, right? So. Yeah, so I started publicly bitching about Qualcomm, I guess, about 2 years ago, and talked more and more and more, and fought with Qualcomm people. I had talks with their lawyers, I had talks with their sales guys. No one wanted to talk to me because I was a dirty, dirty, dirty hacker. Finally, I did a talk at ShmooCon, actually right before at Blue Hat, and met Brian. Brian and his team are incredibly awesome, and almost every ill will and hatred I had towards the company turned into love because I actually like this one small group of guys. Having said that, if I had ever signed an NDA with you, I'd be violating the crap out of it for the rest of this talk, but I have not, and y'all seem to be cool with that, which is nice. Lastly, I'll caveat that when I first contacted Qualcomm with the power stuff that we'll get to right after this, I promise, they said there's no problem. And then they said there was no problem. And then I got an email with a bug number saying, there's totally no problem, but here's a bug tracking thing that we're just making sure to look into it. And about 2 days ago, I got an email saying, that thing that didn't exist that wasn't a problem is still not a problem, but it's been fixed, and you will get an attribution for it being fixed. It's on our website. So I'm like, cool, none of this stuff actually works, but it's been fixed. So random desk prawn, getting back to it, This is some random Sony phone. You see the PCB. This is a Moto X, if I'm gonna guess right. You know, I don't even remember what the hell this was. It's like just a bunch of random phones. That's what I do. This is my desk. I get phones. I take them apart. I play with them. I look at them. I try to pop them. When I'm done with them, I put them back in the case. They go in the pink box. When the pink box is full, the pink box goes on eBay, and I get a new pink box. This is my life. This is what I do. And Domo-kun helps me out. It's pretty easy. So let's poke at that dev platform, because that's what's actually interesting. My hypothesis, and this is actually Charlie Miller's fault from the Black Hat talk years ago about batteries, right? Like you poked at Apple batteries, and I was like, wait, you could weaponize that and then put it in someone's pocket. That'd be really, really cool, or horrible, bad, no one should do that. But if I'm in the kernel, which is not hard to do, I can probably control all the voltage in the phone. And is there any protections to keep me from doing anything really stupid or bad there? And so I arbitrarily just picked the Sony, and you know that's what we're going to poke at. But what I saw in general with all of these phones is they're all based on that reference platform. So if it was viable to do an attack on the Sony, it was viable to do it on some other vendor that I can't name. Pretty much all of the vendors, because they all, you know, if there was not a resistor or a capacitor to keep me from pushing too much voltage here, it was on every phone because it's on your sales platform. And everyone just kind of takes that and goes, oh, someone did a lot of engineering for us. I don't have to. I'm lazy. So yeah, the battery stores raw power. This is kind of our context, right? USB pushes power into the system. You have a PMIC, which is a very typical hardware thing that basically manages I shall push power here, here, and here, that is utilized to distribute the voltages around the internals of your phone. The kernel manages the PMIC. The PMIC is really slow. It's like an ARM 7 or an ARM 9 compared to the actual crate cores. It's really, really slow. And the crux, if you walked out right now, is that not all traces coming out of the battery and out of the PMIC that go certain places, like your screen or your Wi-Fi chip, are protected by really, really cheap caps and resistors. You're talking about 1/10 of a penny, probably in mass production. But it takes engineering to put them there, and they take size, and they have heat dissipation, and they didn't do it, and that's problematic. So how do we get into power regulation? If you look at Linux, because it's well documented and it's very, very old, you go to Documentation Power Regulator Overview, and this thing tells you exactly how power flows through a Linux system. It's pretty simple, it's amazingly well documented for Linux, and it will basically say that there are less than 10 .c and .h files throughout all of the kernel that control voltage flow. People have figured this out way before when they've tried to overclock processors, and with everything else in Android, it's basically just the Linux kernel, so it got ported over. What you want for any specific target you have is you're going to have a yourproductname_regulator.c file. And that file defines exactly how power flows throughout that whole PCB. That is the magic sauce secret. It's just got some numbers in there. You change those numbers, and you've hacked some phones. I did all this blind. If one were to search the internets for a while, you can find a nice dump of Qualcomm documentation that may make this research a lot easier. I did not know this existed until after I had wrapped this project, and I got really frustrated because if I had seen those docs prior, I totally would have done this in half the time and different. So if you're really curious to go after this, I did not tell you there's docs and you're not going to get them from me, but they're out there, and they're not that hard to find. So again, we're poking on Sony, blah, blah, blah. This thing's called Yougo, so actually we're looking at Yougo_regulator for the rest of this. The first thing that we have to nullify when we're attacking a phone is the thermal regulator. This thing is a nice little sensor, and this sensor detects how hot or cold things in the phone are. They don't want it to catch fire and blow up in your pocket, and I want it to catch fire and blow up in your pocket. So this is like my first attack surface. The regulator in general is really simple. It's run by a daemon, which is thermal D, that kind of runs and checks everything. First thing I was just like, well, kill the daemon, right? A lot of things rely on this to figure out like how fast to charge the battery, how slow, should I turn the screen on, do I do brightness? This thing's really complex and everything is latching into thermal D to get data. So I just started killing it. Really didn't work because the phone didn't run, so I started looking down into it, and it's got, at one point, code that basically says, if you hit this temperature, do this. If you hit this temperature, do this. So it's like the first one is just, start shutting down processes to try to cool the processor off, all the way to shut down the phone. But they're just numbers, so I just changed the numbers and hit recompile. So now instead of shutting the phone off at like 100 degrees, it has to get to 6 million degrees before it decides to shut off. I figure I can get fire before then. So yeah, we can't use thermal. We can't use that thing to directly fry the thing, but we kind of got to neuter it. It's easier to tweak it than to just kill it. So we're going to attack the sock on this phone. This was my horrible research fail that I actually should have presented at FailCon instead. The crate cores directly, if you just go, I want to give you a ton of voltage, are really good at that front door to say like, no man, you can't do that. All the internal protections seem to work. Basically, if you push too much voltage through, they just reboot. So you get a really unstable phone that you can't do much with, but that's not really fire. So as an aside, every person on the internet, if you ever like Google, I want to overclock X, there's always that one dude on the forums that's like, man, if you overclock your computer, it's going to catch fire. Like, F that guy. Because if I could have done that, this would be a totally different presentation. I had my Sony thinking it was running at 6.6 gigahertz instead of 1.2 or 2.0. Like, it really should have caught fire if that guy was right. But he's a liar, and we hate him. But I can overclock like crazy, and I can push too much voltage through, and I can tweak the settings just right before the sock turns off, at which point I'm using a lot more power than I normally am. From there, I'm also in the kernel, so I can change the USB stack to basically say never allow me to charge. So I'm overclocking and burning a ton of power. I'm not able to charge. I can persist those values on reboot, so basically once the phone runs through that battery once, it can never be charged again, and we have our first brick. It's kind of a hacky brick, so I only get 0.5 for it, and Qualcomm gets a 1 because they actually did a good job, but we're in keeping score. I kind of won. We've got 1 brick that goes in the graveyard. But I looked at way more than just the main sock. NAND is kind of a thing I like to poke at, so we poked at that next. In the Qualcomm design, they've actually got this nice little thing that sits in the middle of powering both NAND and the SD card controller, if your phone uses SD. And this is the 7X00A SDCC. So it sits on the traces, gets power from the PMIC through the battery, PMIC, this thing, and then it pushes voltage out both ways. And regulator.c gets changed. These values are kind of junky. You got to play with them quite a bit. But for this first hack, all we did was, I have a pointer. So it was saying, give this guy 2.95 volts of power, basically. And I just roughly doubled that. Now we're pushing way more power into NAND for reads and writes than we should. And you have to do it twice. And when we do that, really simply, so we're talking about changing 2 numerical values in compiled code if you don't want to recompile. When we do that, every time that the processor reaches out to NAND to try to read data, it gets massively corrupted coming back. Every time we try to write to NAND, it gets massively corrupted when writing because there's just too much power trying to do that. The NAND that is on the Sonys, at least, doesn't handle that well. And for some weird reason, at least on fast reboots, and I think it's a problem of warm versus cold reboot, but the PMIC values seem to be stored they don't have to reset from the kernel when it's booting back up. So those PMIC values that I'm seeing, if I just do a quick reboot of the phone, now I'm not only corrupting what I was trying to read, but I've corrupted the whole OS on disk, because when it's reached out to try to read it from NAND, it's corrupted those NAND blocks, and it still thinks it's fine, but it's not. Now we have a pretty deep brick on the phone, because all the NAND is just garbage at that point. All the blocks basically are dead. We've pushed too much power in, and they just don't work anymore. So we kind of broke it, but it was really ugly. At this point, I got curious. What if we just, instead of doubling the voltage to try to fry a component, what if we half the voltage? This was way cooler to me. Whoa. So on lower voltages, NAND reads still work. So you can pull data in, you can read it like normal, your phone's running. As soon as you try to write, that write returns that, yes, I wrote correctly. But most of the time, it actually didn't write correctly. Depending on how you set those voltages, it almost never writes correctly. So you can, with changing 2 numerical values in a runtime kernel, you can basically inject a write blocker into a phone just by playing with values. And I thought that was kind of cool, personally. And again, it persists over reboot if you've actually written those values back into the kernel. So now we do have a brick, and we've got a fairly controlled brick that we can play with. So if we're keeping score, I'm ahead right now. Let's try to enjoy that, because it won't last. Attacking Wi-Fi. Again, it's built into the SoC. The SoC does have some ball grid array pins at the bottom of the SoC that come out that are direct access to the hardware internal. So not everything has to go through the main front door. You'll see when you look at the regulator file, which we'll pull up in a little bit, it's basically got 3 regulators, L4, 10, and S2, are used to power and control Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi chips are pretty easy to manipulate because the kernel and the just runtime environment knows that Wi-Fi chips can drain a ton of power, so it already dynamically scales how much power this thing needs based on how crappy your Wi-Fi connection is. If you've got really good signal, it actually powers, does a low power mode on Wi-Fi because it doesn't need to push a ton of power in. And there's some other configuration stuff that's documented in the white paper on just how the Wi-Fi chip itself works. But you play with those 3 values, and you can start trying to fry the actual Wi-Fi chip. Again, it was protected inside the SoC, so all of the direct attacks I did to it basically didn't fry it. I could not as reliably with NAND, I could get it to work every time with the write blocker. With Wi-Fi, I can edge up and corrupt a lot of the data, so you could do some weird, really way too expensive pseudo denial of service, but it wasn't really sexy. But someone could probably poke harder there and get some interesting things with Wi-Fi. But I couldn't burn anything internal to the SoC. USB, we kind of already went over. USB starts getting a little more complicated than the direct attacks we were doing. So now we've got PMIC values that actually, we're also having to deal with GPIO pins. Sony did really well to protect against this. Samsung has failed horribly on this front. The Galaxy S3 in particular, a lot of people around the world were having issues where they turned on USB on the go, so they should be able to power something. As soon as they plug something in that wants power, there's a little handshake over USB that says, hey, I want 5 volts, and the phone goes, cool, I'll give you 5 volts. And there's a trace that goes between there for USB that's got a nice little cap on it that basically can't handle 5 volts, so when you try to push voltage through, it blows that cap, and now you've got a bricked phone. I didn't even have to do this, I just Googled for this one and tried to figure out what happened. So Sony actually does better there. They can do on-the-go power. Samsung failed and got a whole bunch of RMAs before they fixed the problem, I believe. But with USB, we're controlling voltages. We can, the same trickery with NAND and Wi-Fi, we can corrupt a whole bunch of data in transit. We can do the disable charging trick, which I mentioned earlier, which basically means that we can break any phone we want, but it's not sexy. I did try to push a ton of voltage over OTG, and basically got it to the limit that the battery could push. But again, it's at that point, we're not attacking the phone, we're attacking whatever trinkety thing we plugged into the phone to power. And I don't expect a lot of those to actually be resilient, and they weren't. So, not a win, not a loss. Attacking the power plane. So whenever you're looking at PCB design in general, if you get to that level of hardware, you'll notice that there's, multi-planes wrapped in silicon, and that's your PCB. One of those planes typically is power, one of those is typically ground. So my question was, what if I up the power on that? This is for components that aren't specifically saying, I need 1.2 volts. They're just like, I need the resident 3.3 on the platform, and they all just kind of power off this ground plane. It's easier than doing a whole bunch of specific traces from the PMIC. But the PMIC pushes that 3.3 volts down there. We up that, and we broke the phone. I mean, it was broken. It was the best break I had. I actually broke 3 phones and put them in a little graveyard for it. But I have no idea what broke. It was some one too many random components internal to the phone that I could never get it to boot at all, and none of my analysis could figure out what happened. But if all you wanted to do was kill a phone in motion, dump 6 volts to the ground or to the power plane instead of 3.3, and you've got fire. Or not fire, but a dead, broken hunk of plastic in your pocket. The Sony actually has 2 or 3 power planes. They've got a 1.2, 3.3, and I think one more that is powering from the battery. So there's a lot of discrete components you can attack if all you want to do is ruin $700 worth of phone for somebody. Getting into more kind of discrete targets that the white paper will cover in detail, I attacked the screen in the same way, tried to push too much voltage to it. No surprise, I can corrupt the data like crazy. I can definitely not power the screen. But it doesn't really brick anything. The screen, if you flash a new kernel and everything and push it back on, it works. The camera, kind of the same thing. One of the cameras never kind of worked, but the other 2 or 3 phones that tried it on continued to work, so I'm going to call that a fail. Audio hardware, kind of not real interesting, but I mean, what are you going to do? You want to not have someone listen to MP3s, that's not great. I did not spend really any time with the hexagon or the baseband because Ralph, RPW, kind of lives there, and if he hasn't pulled it off, then I'm not going to. So I was lazy and just kind of went, you could probably do the same thing. So at this point, right before we get to the actual battery attacks, I've had 7 or 8 phones that I've broken. I'm going to give myself a score of 2.5, and Qualcomm actually gets a 4. They hurt me pretty quick, but I do still have a handful of bricks on my desk. The battery. Everything else that I've talked about here in the paper was 2, 3, 4, maybe 10 lines of code to change. The battery was freaking hard. Way more components to tweak to try to either dump way too much power into it while charging or completely empty the battery. There was a lot of code that had to change. In general, the way the batteries work, and it's not in the slides because I fail, is there's an embedded microcontroller in the battery that basically handles, am I charged, am I not charged? On the Sonys in particular, that thing can be disabled by the kernel. The kernel can say, hey, I'm smarter than you, Mr. Battery. I'm going to manage you. So that was kind of the first thing you had to do. After disable thermal regulation and then have the kernel take control of battery management. At that point, I had to start playing with how much voltage can we actually push here and there. Can I push more? How much can I get out of the wall? Okay, how much can I get out of a better wall plug, like maybe 220 instead of 110 in the US? Like how much, if I've got no protections even on my cable, I'm just plugging into 110 coming out of the wall, how much can I get in the phone? Tweaking with these same things, basically, I'm just trying to push as much voltage as possible and burn this phone as quickly as possible. I get it really hot. Like a lot of the Sony phones that I have right now, if you boot them, you can't pick them up. They are way too hot for that. They burn through the battery too fast to do anything but be really, really, really hot. And they don't actually catch fire, they don't melt, but man, they feel like if I could just get another 10 minutes of battery life out of them, they probably would. But I can't sustain that without killing the phone and having to recharge it. So that was all internal to the phone, and then I was like, okay, well, if I allow myself to plug into the wall, can I get it hotter and actually get melting? I got a phone that the back of the plastic started melting from the battery, but I still couldn't achieve fire, and it was recoverable once I flashed another firmware on there. It never really worked again in a functional, like I want to use this as a daily driver, but it was basically a fail. So to attack the battery, I had to turn off all the thermal checks, turn off all the voltage fail-safes, capacity fail-safes, which basically the battery says, I can only take 100% charge. And you're like, no, man, actually you can take 1,000% charge. Or there's other checks that basically say, I will never allow myself to get below 2% charged, and you actually set that to -2 or 0. There's a lot of exploration probably still left in like fast charging. If you're interested in the 2 months of failure I had with that, the doc starting at page 62 and going to like 110 documents, everything I tried and failed. Speaking of the doc, it is here because everything I did is open source, so you should be able to go to GitHub and pull down not only the doc, but every single stage of kernel modules to play with this. And in general and very fast, that is burner. So I'm going to say thank you. Do we have any questions about burner before I move on to new stuff at all? Way in the back.
So you can only change the values once, then you have to recompile, so you're not able to, say, pulse the values between different extremes, are you?
So if you start digging into Regulator more, and again, there was so much to cover, I kind of breezed over a lot of it, but there are some things like the main processor, Wi-Fi, things that do have dynamic power during runtime. Some of those values are actually stored in an XML file just in the root, just root of phone. So those you can just plain text edit. There's other ones that you would have to like sideload a module that would do it for you, but they are about half the components on the phone have dynamic voltage, so you could easily glitch that way, because I think that's pretty much what you're getting at is some sort of glitching. There's other components that just say, I shall only ever use 1.2 volts, and those are more of a, from what I could figure out, was a change it once, load module on phone, didn't work, reboot, change value, load module. Does that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and I rushed through that because I actually wanted to talk about something else as well. But first I wanted to say thank you to Thomas for